The sirens that were heard in the background were loud as they pulled up to the police department in Candy Water. Sheriff Jim Harris turned off the sirens as he turned off his Chevy Tahoe. Sheriff Harris rarely makes appearances in Candy Water. The last time he was here was 2 years ago. That was during his re-election bid. Sheriff James was in his office preparing his public speech. Deputy Garza was writing the report from the silos. The other 2 deputies were filing the evidence gathered from the silo. Don welcomed Sheriff Harris and directed him to Sheriff James' office. Sheriff Harris walked into the office of Sheriff James. Sheriff Harris appeared to be heartbroken over the death of Sarah Vila. There wasn't many murders in this county. Sheriff Harris has been elected for over 10 years now. He could count the number of murders in one hand that have happened throughout the 6 cities that are within his county. The last happened 2 years ago, just outside of Christ Bay, but that investigation only lasted 3 days. In fact, it didn't involve the sheriff doing much work at all. It turns out a 30-year-old husband murdered his wife. He couldn't live with the guilt, so he turned himself in. As for the city of Candy Water, well, this place has been settled for over 100 years. This is the first murder case. It may be hard to believe that is the first, but this is an ideal town. Crimes like this just doesn't happen here. Sheriff Harris takes a seat as Sheriff James briefs him on what they have discovered so far. Sheriff James also goes over his speech of what he has included and left off. Sheriff Harris commends him and the department for the handling of the case so far. Sheriff James thanks Harris and informs him the press will be arriving shortly for a press conference. It's then that Sheriff Harris breaks the news to James. Harris tells James the FBI will be getting involved. The FBI field office called Sheriff Harris and talked to him. They will be sending an agent Friday morning. Sheriff James tells Sheriff Harris this is not a problem. He has worked with the agency before and welcomes their help. The FBI is useful and resourceful, but not if you're traveling faster than 100 miles per hour. That's exactly what Joe Jr. and the boys were doing as they played their racing game. The boys have been playing since coming home from school. They had not brought up what happened, but after a few races, they decided to talk about it. Of course, the topic was about who it could be. They figured it wasn't anybody from their grade. They had seen everyone as they left school. So they came to the conclusion it was someone from a grade ahead of them. Steve mentioned he saw a group of juniors crying in the hallway. Now the next question was if it was a boy or girl. Rick says it has to be a boy, more specifically a football player. Because after all, they canceled school, and they wouldn't do that if it was not someone important like a football player. They love football players around here. Ryan disagreed with Rick. It has to be a girl. That's why there was a group of people crying. It would be more common for people to cry over a girl than a boy. Even if it was a football player, not that many would shed tears. Steve decides to give his perspective on the situation. It doesn't matter if it was a boy or a girl. What matters is how it happened. Did the person do it on their own, or did someone take their life? Makes you wonder if there's someone on the loose doing these things to people. Joe Jr. cuts in after everyone said their words. When you step back and look at the whole picture, there's a lot going on here. Can anyone remember when something like this took place? This is something that has not taken place in a long time or has never happened at all. The boys look at the clock and didn't realize how much time had passed. It was nearly past 3. Ryan uses the phone to call his mom's workplace. Ryan's mom works in daughter at a doctor's office. Ryan's dad works in Christ Bay and is a truck driver. He usually is gone for 3 days and comes home for 3 days. Ryan tells his mom what happened at school, and he is safe over at Joe Jr.'s home. His mom tells him she won't be home till after 6, and that his dad won't be home till tomorrow. She tells Ryan to stay at Joe Jr.'s house till 5 and then go home. Ryan says okay and then hangs up the phone. He tells the guys about his situation, and they go back to playing video games. Joe Sr. walks into the room and tells them to turn off the video games and go into the living room. So the boys do as they are told and make their way to the living room. Also in the room are Ray and Michael. They gather around the television set and await for the special news presentation. It is about the developing situation in Candy Water. It's nearly an hour before the town of Candy Water and the county gather by their television sets. At the Sheriff Department building, Sheriff Harris and Sheriff James are about to interview the friends of Sarah Vila. They gathered the 4 of her closest friends. Unfortunately, the office is small and only has one interrogation room. When the friends were brought in, one was placed in the interview room, while another was placed in an open jail cell, and the other sat in the lobby area with Don. The other friend was in the office of Deputy Garza. Sheriff Harris would interview 2 of the kids in the interview room. He had began with one already in the room. Trish was the same age as Sarah. She had known her since first grade. She was devastated to learn of Sarah's demise. She had no idea of how or why this could have happened. Trish was dismissed by Sheriff Harris. She was to wait for her parents to pick her up. The second person Sheriff Harris interviewed was Mark. Like Trish, he was the same age as Sarah and had known each other since first grade. Mark began to cry as Sheriff Harris broke the news to him. Sheriff Harris also dismissed Mark and told him to wait for his parents. The other 2 students were interviewed by Sheriff James in his office. Sheriff James went into Deputy Garza's office to retrieve Tony. They went into Sheriff James' office where he told Tony about Cyril. Tony was in shock and couldn't speak as he broke into tears and had trouble breathing. The only information gathered was that Tony was the same age as Sarah and had known her since the first grade. Sheriff James walked Tony out of the office and into the lobby. Tony united with Trish and Mark, and the 3 were in disbelief and crying as they waited to be picked up by their parents. Sheriff James then called the last a friend to join him in his office. Emily entered Sheriff James' office. Like the others, she was the same age as Sarah and had known her since the first grade. When she was told the news of Sarah, she cried. But she seemed different than the others. Sheriff James also noted that Emily looked nervous. Still, Sheriff James released her. Emily was taken to the lobby and rejoined her other friends. Sheriff James slipped a note to Don before walking away. Don got the note and read what Sheriff James had wrote. Keep a settled eye on them and your ears open should these kids talk. Don crumbled the note and threw it away. She tried not to be obvious as she looked towards the kids. Don's attention was sidetracked as she noticed the media personnel had pulled up. In walked a camera crew with a news interviewer. For the past hour, Sheriff James had interviewed the students. Now it was time to brief the city and county. James escorted the news crew into his office. As he told them where to go, he glanced at the kids and then back at Don. Sheriff Harris told James he felt he could handle the broadcast. Sheriff Harris left James to do it alone, so he could go over to the Vila family house. Sheriff James agreed with Harris. It was 10 minutes to broadcast time. Sheriff Harris was at the Vila residence, and Sheriff James was ready to go on air. Back at the Rivera residence, the 3 adults and 4 teenagers awaited for the news. There was no traffic down Main Street. Heck, even the state highway was briefly emptying. The county, small town, and the surrounding areas waited for Sheriff James to brief them. We interrupt your regular scheduled program with an important announcement. From the Channel 5 news station, we take you live to the newsroom. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Maria Hill. We apologize for interrupting your daily programming. We have a serious and tragic statement coming from the city of Candy Water. Joining us live from Candy Water is Chip Overton. Chip, how are you doing today? Thank you, Maria. We are here at Candy Water after being told of a tragedy that occurred here earlier in the day. We were told by Sheriff Ron James that a high school student was found deceased inside a grain silo. At this time, we will turn our attention over to Sheriff James. Thank you, Chip. And thank the news outlet for coming out here today. Earlier in the day, we responded to a call at a local grain facility. What was discovered was a tragic and haunting scene. The body was identified as Sarah Vila, a 16-year-old and junior in Candy Water. As the broadcast carried on, the Rivera residence was left in shock. The boys knew her, not too well, but had come across her before. Sarah led the food drive last year. Joe Jr. and Rick took a lot of canned goods to her. They remembered she smiled and said thank you. The boys remembered that smile, it was infectious. Another thing they remembered from a month ago was running into her at the video rental store. Ryan reached over to grab the last copy of a scary movie. Sarah had also grabbed the video. She was cool and let them have it. She just smiled at them and told them to enjoy the movie. Sarah Vila. Oh no, that's the daughter of Jim and Stacy. Aside from being members of the PTA, Joe Sr., Ray and Michael know Jim. Up until 3 months ago, they would have breakfast over at the diner. This was shocking. The three men thought, how can this happen in their town? It was then that Ray looked over and out the window towards the Lance house. At this point we have concluded that foul play was involved. We are actively pursuing leads and following up with all associates of Sarah. We also asked, should anyone have information, please stop by the sheriff department. Also, from now and until further notice, we are placing a 6 p.m. curfew for all residents of Candy Water. Please respect the privacy of the family and God bless you all, thank you. Sheriff James and the news crew signed off. After the broadcast it was past 4:30. Joe Sr. and the other men walked out of the living room. Joe Jr. signals for the rest of them to go into his room. The boys were taken back from what they heard about Sarah. It all feels unreal, the weight of the incident bears down upon them. They might not have known Sarah very well, but the fact of the situation is that there is a killer in town. Ryan looks at the time. Damn, it's almost 5 o'clock. He says his goodbyes and is ready to go home. The boys tell Ryan to be careful. They tell him not to take the shortcut, for him to stay on the main road. They also tell him to call Joe Jr. after he gets home. Ryan tells him not to worry, he will give them a call when he gets home. Luckily for the other boys, they live close by. The curfew doesn't matter to them since they literally are steps away from their homes. Ryan's house is at the end of town. It's eastbound heading towards Cotton Town. If Ryan takes the main road, down the cul-de-sac and to the state highway, it is a 1.5 mile walk. But if Ryan takes the shortcut home, then it involves a different route. It would involve Ryan jumping over the back fence of Joe Jr.'s house and go down the alley. From there, he would have go down the county road the boys call Shadowbrook Road. That route is only 1 mile long. Close to the home of the Vila family is Stacy's sister and Jim's cousin. Both family members are married but have no kids. They go over to the house to console their family members. Sheriff Harris exited the Vila residence as the family members came over. It had been a long and tragic day for the Vila family. Sheriff Harris made his way back to the office. Harris walked into an empty lobby and a departing Dawn. Gino, the nighttime operator, was settling in for the night. Sheriff James and Deputy Garza are in the office and welcome back Sheriff Harris. Upon arriving, Sheriff Harris tells Deputy Garza to go home and get rest for tomorrow. Harris also tells James that he sent the other 2 officers home. He tells James not to worry, and he has 2 other deputies from Cotton Town patrolling the town tonight. Sheriff James thanks Harris for his assistance and appreciates the additional help. Sheriff Harris also tells James for him to go home and get some rest. Tomorrow is a new day, and it will be the long one. In fact, all the days will be long from here on out. Or at least until they capture the killer. Before the 2 leave, Sheriff Harris asked a question. How many murder cases have you dealt with, Mr. James? I believe 8 in total, Sheriff Harris. If you don't mind me asking, how old was the youngest murderer victim? The youngest was a 23-year-old male. My partner and me responded to shots fired at a neighborhood. We were the first unit on scene. A small crowd had gathered in the streets. We cleared the crowd that circled around the victim. The victim had a knife in his hand and a bullet hole in his head. The victim was dead on the scene. It took us 4 days to crack the case. We were lucky, we had cooperative witnesses. We tracked him down to a warehouse. The guy was drugged up and we had a small shootout. No officers got hurt, the suspect sustained a shot to the leg. All of that happened over a $20 dispute. $20, you say? What the hell is this world coming to, James? Any thoughts on this case? Give me your professional opinion. I'm not sure yet. Her friends are a bit suspicious. I think they know more than what they are telling us. Hopefully the coroner report will also be helpful. I hope so, James. The FBI agent will be here first thing in the morning. I will stop by tomorrow afternoon. Let me know if you need additional help. The two shook hands and departed the office. As 6 o'clock rolled around, the streets of Candy Water were empty. The only cars were the ones on the state highway. The drivers from those cars looked on as if Candy Water had become a ghost town. It may have looked like a ghost town after 6, but down the cul-de-sac it was anything but a ghost town. There stood 3 neighbors wondering whether they knew who the murderer was. Their belief was strong, but they had no solid proof of what they believed. Joe Sr. still remained skeptical that the Lance family had anything to do with the murder. Ray was convinced the Lance family was the murderer. Michael felt it could be them. He needed evidence, and the only way to get the evidence, it was up to them. The boys played their last game in Joe Jr.'s room. It was past 6 and they didn't want to get in trouble. Joe Jr. was a little concerned. He saw the time and realized that Ryan hadn't called yet. Rick told him not to worry, he was probably just cleaning the house and will call later. Joe Jr. felt Rick was all right. Rick and Steve walked out of Joe Jr.'s house. The sun was almost set as darkness began to creep in. Rick walked around the yard over to his house and saw his dad carrying something in his hand. He was walking over to Steve's house. Steve walked across the street and passed his dad and Joe Sr. Joe Jr. looked at what his dad and the others were doing. Joe Jr. shook his head and walked back inside his house. Ray brought over his video camera, and Joe Sr. brought a blank video cassette. Michael had a tripod, and the 3 walked inside Michael's house. The 3 came up with an ingenious idea. They would mount the video camera up and point it at the direction of the Lance house. Michael would keep an eye out, and once he was ready for sleep, he would start recording on the camera. They would try to capture anything the Lance did during the night. The 3 had felt it was a good idea. Night had come and gone, and the sun rose on another day. As the sun rose, a black sedan car entered the Candy Water city limits. Joe Sr. walked outside with a cup of coffee to admire his nice green grass. Michael came out of the house. He made eye contact with Joe Sr. and waved the tape. Michael has a smile on his face. Ray came out of his house and saw Michael with the tape. A smile came over Ray's face as well. The phone rang in Joe Sr.'s house. Rita answered the phone. Her face dropped and she ran over to Joe Jr.'s room. Rita's fears grew after leaving Joe Jr.'s room. She went outside to talk to Joe Sr. Ryan never made it home. 3. The